June 1st, 1942, the morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, as Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles and surveyed the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the taste of revenge still burned bitter in every American sailor's mouth. What McCluskey didn't know was that in less than 72 hours, he would lead one of the most decisive airstrikes in naval history. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, studying intercepted Japanese communications that had been decoded by his intelligence team. The cryptanalysts had worked tirelessly to break the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25, and what they discovered sent shockwaves through the Pacific Command. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was planning something massive. The target, Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of land 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. According to the National WWII Museum records, Japan's strategy aimed to remove the United States as a Pacific power and use Midway as a base to attack Pearl Harbor again. Yamamoto's plan was audacious in its complexity. Operation Me, as the Japanese called it, would involve nearly every major vessel in the Imperial Navy. The mastermind behind Pearl Harbor intended to lure what remained of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where superior Japanese numbers and experience would crush American naval power once and for all. For aircraft carriers would spearhead the assault: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same man who had led the Pearl Harbor strike. The Japanese plan unfolded like a deadly chess game. Vice Admiral Nobute Kondo would lead an invasion force of transports and warships to capture Midway's airfield and establish a forward base. Meanwhile, Yamamoto himself would command the main battle fleet from his flagship, the massive battleship Yamato, positioned to intercept and destroy any American forces that dared to challenge the operation. But American codebreakers had given Nimitz an unprecedented advantage. Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rockford, had penetrated deep into Japanese communications. They knew not just that an attack was coming, but when and where. The only question remaining was whether the battered Pacific Fleet could mount an effective defense against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron paced the ready room aboard USS Hornet, briefing his torpedo bomber pilots on their upcoming mission. Torpedo Squadron 8 had never seen combat, but Waldron sensed that their baptism of fire would come soon. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who understood the stakes. If Midway fell, the West Coast would lie exposed to Japanese attack, and the war in the Pacific could be lost. As the sun set on June 1st, 3 American aircraft carriers steamed toward their destiny. Enterprise and Hornet formed Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, while the hastily repaired Yorktown sailed as Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. The Yorktown had limped back from the Coral Sea battle just days earlier, her flight deck passed and her crew exhausted, but Nimitz needed every available ship. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. On one side, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled, confident in their superiority and hungry for decisive victory. On the other, a smaller American fleet armed with intelligence, determination, and the burning desire to avenge Pearl Harbor. Neither force knew that in the coming days, the course of World War II would hinge on the skill of pilots, the courage of sailors, and split-second decisions made in the crucible of combat. The Pacific Ocean, vast and seemingly peaceful under the stars, would soon become the stage for the most important naval battle of the 20th century. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 2nd, both fleets moved inexorably toward their rendezvous with destiny at a tiny atoll called Midway. June 3rd, 1942. The first light of dawn on June 3rd revealed a scene that would have been impossible just months earlier, for massive Japanese aircraft carriers cut through the swells, 300 miles northwest of Midway, their flight decks bustling with activity as ground crews prepared aircraft for the coming assault. Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, watching his pilots receive their final briefings. The same man who had delivered the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor now commanded the most formidable carrier strike force in the world. At 0 for 30 hours, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the first wave of Japanese aircraft into the gray morning sky. 108 planes, 36 Aichi dive bombers, 36 Nakajima torpedo bombers, and 36 Zero fighters formed up in perfect formation. Before turning southeast toward Midway, below them, the vast Pacific stretched endlessly, concealing the American fleet that was even now racing to intercept them. On Midway itself, the defenders had been awake for hours. Marine Air Group 22 had every available aircraft ready for takeoff, from obsolete Brewster Buffaloes to more modern Grumman Wildcats. Major Floyd Parks commanded the fighter squadron with grim determination, knowing his pilots faced overwhelming odds, but refusing to yield an inch of American territory without a fight. Historical records from the Naval History and Heritage Command document that PBY Catalinas and B-17s were stationed on Midway along with 4,000 American personnel by June 1942. At 0534, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PBY Catalina patrol bomber on his regular morning reconnaissance, spotted something that made his blood run cold. Through the morning haze, he could see the unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese warships to carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers stretching to the horizon. Reed's radio crackled to life as he transmitted the message that would alert the American fleet. Enemy carriers bearing 3-0, distance 180 miles from Midway. The battle had begun. Major Lofton Henderson led 27 Marine dive bombers in a desperate attack against Nagumo's carriers, knowing that his obsolete aircraft stood little chance against veteran Japanese pilots. Flying superior Zeros, Henderson's voice echoed over the radio as he led his men into their final dive. "This is it. Boys, let's give 'em hell." The Marine Major's aircraft erupted in flames as Zero bullets found their mark, but his sacrifice inspired his pilots to press home their attacks with suicidal courage. Meanwhile, Captain James Collins commanded the Army Air Force bombers based on Midway. His B-26 Marauders and B-17 Flying Fortresses launched attack after attack against the Japanese fleet, their high-altitude bombing runs achieving little damage but forcing Nagumo to keep his combat air patrol active and his ships maneuvering violently to avoid the falling bombs. The Japanese strike on Midway began at 0620, when Tomonaga's aircraft appeared over the atoll like a swarm of deadly insects. The Marine fighters rose to meet them, but the obsolete Buffaloes were no match for the nimble Zeros. Captain Marion Carl, flying one of the few Wildcats, managed to down several Japanese planes, but the defenders were hopelessly outnumbered. Bombs rained down on Midway's installations as the Japanese pilots methodically targeted fuel dumps, hangars, and the critical airstrip. Buildings exploded in gouts of flame and debris as the atoll shuddered under the impact of high explosive bombs. Yet despite the ferocity of the attack, Midway's runways remained operational, and its radar installations continued to function. Lieutenant Tomonaga circled over the burning atoll, assessing the damage his strike had inflicted. Speaking into his radio, he transmitted the message that would ultimately doom the Japanese fleet. There is need for a second attack wave. That single communication would force Nagumo into a series of decisions that would seal Japan's fate in the Pacific. Unknown to the Japanese admiral, American codebreakers had already warned Admiral Nimitz of the impending attack. Even as Midway burned, 3 American aircraft carriers were steaming at flank speed toward the Japanese fleet, their flight decks loaded with every available aircraft. The trap that Yamamoto had planned to spring on the Americans was about to be turned against him. As the morning sun climbed higher, both sides prepared for the decisive confrontation. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise at Midway, but strategic surprise belonged to the Americans. In the coming hours, the fate of the Pacific War would rest on the shoulders of young pilots, many of whom would not live to see another sunset. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortune. June 4th, 1942, morning at 0705 hours on June 4th. Admiral Nagumo faced the most crucial decision of his naval career. Standing on the bridge of the Akagi, he held Lieutenant Tomonaga's radio message requesting a second strike on Midway. The first attack had damaged the atoll, but failed to eliminate its air power completely. American planes continued to launch from Midway's battered runways, and Nagumo knew another strike would be necessary to secure the island. But intelligence reports had begun filtering and that changed everything. At 0728, the cruiser tone's reconnaissance aircraft reported sighting American naval vessels northeast of Midway. The pilot's initial message was maddeningly vague. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance to 40 miles from Midway. Nagumo's blood ran cold. If American carriers were in the area, his entire fleet faced mortal danger. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer and one of the Pearl Harbor planners, urged immediate action against the reported American ships, but half of the mobile force's aircraft were already armed with land attack bombs. For the second Midway strike, Converting them to anti-ship configuration would take precious time they might not have. According to Imperial War Museum's documentation, the Battle of Midway began on June 3, 1942, when a U.S. Navy Catalina first sighted Vice Admiral Condo's invasion fleet, 200 miles to the northeast. Admiral Fletcher aboard USS Yorktown had already begun launching aircraft. At 0606, he had received the electrifying message from Midway reporting the Japanese carriers. Fletcher immediately ordered Admiral Spruance to proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers. When definitely located, the American trap was about to be sprung. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay prepared his Torpedo Squadron 6 aboard Enterprise for what he knew would be a one-way mission. The Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were obsolete, slow, and vulnerable, but they were all the Americans had. As Lindsay climbed into his cockpit, he turned to his gunner, Aviation Radio Man Second Class Charles Moore, and said simply, "This is what we trained for." At 0755, Nagumo made his fateful decision. Despite the threat of American carriers, he ordered his second attack wave to be rearmed with land attack bombs for another strike on Midway. It was a decision born of incomplete intelligence and the pressure of maintaining his attack schedule, but it would prove catastrophic. For the next crucial hour, his most powerful strike aircraft would be unavailable for action, trapped below deck while ordnance crews frantically switched their armament. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his Torpedo Squadron 8 off the deck of USS Hornet on a collision course with Destiny. The 15 TBD Devastators flew low over the waves, their crews knowing they faced almost certain death, but determined to strike a blow for their country. Waldron had briefed his pilots with characteristic bluntness, "If there's only one plane left to make a final run, I want that man to go in and get a hit." At 0820, the Japanese reconnaissance aircraft from Tone finally provided the information. That sent shockwaves through the mobile force, enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier bearing 080 degrees, distance 20 miles from Midway. An American carrier was not only present, but dangerously close. Nagumo immediately ordered his aircraft to be rearmed with anti-ship weapons, but it was too late. The die had been cast. The flight deck of Akagi became a scene of controlled chaos as ordnance crews desperately switched bombs for torpedoes and armor-piercing shells. Fuel lines snaked across the deck as aircraft were refueled, and ammunition was stacked everywhere. What had once been a model of Japanese naval efficiency now became a floating powder keg, vulnerable to the slightest spark. At 0920, American dive bombers appeared on the Japanese radar screens, approaching from multiple directions. But Nagumo's combat air patrol was positioned at low altitude, having just finished massacring the torpedo bombers. The Japanese fighters had no time to climb to intercept altitude before the American SBD Dauntless dive bombers began their deadly descent. From 14,000 feet, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward. Following his instincts, McCluskey followed the wake, and at 0955, he saw them for Japanese aircraft carriers in a neat box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. "Attack! Attack!" McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio as he pushed his SBD into its bombing dive. Behind him, 37 dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown followed him down into the teeth of the Japanese defenses. June 4th, 1942, 0955 hours. Lieutenant Dick Best pushed his SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive, the Japanese carrier Akagi growing larger in his bomb sight with each passing second. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around him like deadly fireworks, but Best held his dive steady, waiting for the perfect moment to release his 1,000-pound bomb. Below him, the pride of the Japanese Navy maneuvered desperately to avoid the American attack. At exactly 10:22 hours, 5 minutes of devastation began that would alter the course of World War II. Best's bomb struck Akagi's flight deck near the amidships elevator, penetrating deep into the carrier's hangar deck where dozens of fueled and armed aircraft awaited launch. The explosion triggered a chain reaction that turned the flagship into a raging inferno. Within minutes, 2 miles away, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's dive bombers against the carrier Soryu. Ensign Frederick Weber's bomb struck the carrier's forward elevator, while 2 more bombs devastated her flight deck. Like Akagi, Soryu became a floating torch as aviation gasoline fed flames that quickly spread throughout the ship. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto chose to go down with his vessel, standing at attention on the bridge as his carrier settled beneath the waves. The National WWII Museum documents indicate that the 5-day battle encompassed an area the size of the contiguous United States, with Japanese and American ships fighting at ranges of 50 to 150 miles apart. The third victim was Kaga, struck by bombs from Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher's squadron. For direct hits transformed Japan's second-largest carrier into a blazing wreck. Commander Takahisa Amagai, Kaga's air officer, watched in horror as months of careful training and irreplaceable aircraft disappeared in minutes. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, pilots who had trained for years and participated in victories across the Pacific, were trapped below deck or died trying to escape the flames. Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, watching his striking force disappear before his eyes. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor now witnessed the destruction of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. With smoke and flames surrounding him, Nagumo reluctantly transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara, leaving his burning flagship to her fate. But the battle was far from over. Captain Taman Yamaguchi aboard the carrier Hiryu had escaped the initial American attack. The aggressive commander immediately ordered a counter-strike against the American fleet, launching 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Yamaguchi's message to his pilots was simple but deadly: find the American carriers and destroy them. At 13:05 hours, Kobayashi's aircraft found their target. USS Yorktown, already damaged from the Coral Sea battle a month earlier, became the focus of a devastating Japanese attack. The ship listed heavily to port, appearing to be sinking. Admiral Fletcher, his flagship apparently doomed, transferred tactical command to Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise. But Yorktown's damage control teams, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich, performed miracles of seamanship. Within 2 hours, they had the fires under control, the flooding stopped, and the ship making 20 knots. To Japanese reconnaissance pilots, she appeared to be a different carrier entirely. The deception proved costly for Japan. At 14:30 hours, Captain Yamaguchi launched his remaining aircraft 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters against what he believed was an undamaged American carrier. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, wounded in the morning's attack on Midway, volunteered to lead this final strike despite his injuries. It would be his last mission. Yorktown's fighters and anti-aircraft guns fought desperately to defend their ship, but the Japanese torpedoes found their mark. The carrier took on a severe list and lost power, forcing her crew to abandon ship. Fletcher's flagship appeared finished, but her sacrifice had drawn the final sting from Japanese naval aviation. Admiral Spruance now faced a crucial decision. His intelligence officers reported that Hiryu remained operational, but the Japanese carrier was beyond the range of his aircraft if they hoped to return before dark. Against the advice of his staff, Spruance chose to launch an immediate strike. At 16:05 hours, Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers under Lieutenant Earl Gallagher for one final attack. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon when Gallagher's aircraft found Hiryu desperately trying to escape northward. For bombs struck the last operational Japanese carrier, starting fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. Captain Yamaguchi, realizing his situation was hopeless, chose to remain aboard his burning vessel. His final message to the fleet was characteristically defiant: "I am proceeding north with Hiryu. We will fight to the end." As darkness fell over the Pacific, for Japanese aircraft carriers lay burning or sinking beneath the waves. With them died Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific and the dreams of empire that had driven the nation to war. The 5 minutes from 10:22 to 10:27 had changed the course of history, transforming American defeat into victory and Japanese triumph into disaster. Captain Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the burning carrier Hiryu, watching flames consume his ship while the sun painted the Pacific blood red. Known throughout the Imperial Navy for his aggressive spirit and tactical brilliance, Yamaguchi had been considered a future commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Now, as his carrier settled deeper into the water, he faced the end of his career and his life with the stoic dignity expected of a Japanese naval officer. The destruction of 4 aircraft carriers in a single day represented more than just ships lost. It marked the death of Japan's elite naval aviation. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now lay wounded aboard the cruiser Nagara, calculated the catastrophe with mathematical precision. Over 300 of Japan's finest pilots had been killed or lost at sea. Men who had required years to train and could never be replaced in time to affect the war's outcome. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Midway operation, received the devastating reports aboard his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west. The man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year in a war with America watched his prediction come true with bitter accuracy. His carefully planned trap had become a disaster of unprecedented proportions. According to Britannica's historical records, the Battle of Midway was fought almost entirely with aircraft, and the American victory effectively ended Japan's ability to prosecute an offensive war in the Pacific. Yet even in defeat, the Japanese Navy retained its fighting spirit. Admiral Yamamoto ordered his surface fleet to proceed eastward for a night engagement, hoping that his battleships and cruisers might salvage something from the wreckage of Operation Me. The massive Yamato, mounting 18-inch guns that could destroy any American ship, led a formation of battleships and cruisers toward what Yamamoto hoped would be a decisive surface action. But Admiral Spruance, commanding the American task force after Fletcher's transfer from the crippled Yorktown, refused to be drawn into a night battle. The cautious admiral recognized that Japanese superiority in night fighting could easily reverse the day's gains. Instead, he ordered his carriers to retire eastward, preserving his forces for future operations. It was a decision that frustrated his more aggressive subordinates, but ultimately proved wise. Aboard the destroyer Hammond, Lieutenant Commander Arnold True worked frantically to save USS Yorktown. Damage control parties had reboarded the abandoned carrier and were making progress in reducing her list and restoring power. The ship that had appeared doomed now seemed to have a chance of survival, a testament to American damage control techniques and the determination of her crew. The Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the American task force since the morning. As the sun set on June 4th, Tanabe found himself in perfect position to attack the crippled Yorktown. At 15:44 hours, he fired for torpedoes at the carrier and her escorts, achieving what the combined Japanese air strikes had failed to accomplish. One torpedo struck Hammond amidships, breaking the destroyer's back and killing her engineering crew instantly. The valiant ship sank in minutes, taking True and dozens of his men with her. 2 more torpedoes found Yorktown, opening massive holes in her hull that finally doomed the gallant carrier. The ship that had fought at Coral Sea and Midway would sink the following morning, taking with her the hopes of immediate American victory. As darkness settled over the battlefield, both sides counted their losses and assessed the strategic situation. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and over 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced pilots. The United States had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 307 men, but had gained something far more valuable: proof that American courage and skill could defeat the supposedly invincible Japanese Navy. Captain Yamaguchi spent his final hours composing letters to his family and emperor, accepting responsibility for the loss of his ship while expressing confidence in Japan's ultimate victory. At 05:10 hours on June 5th, Hiryu's magazines exploded in a pillar of flame visible for 50 miles, carrying Yamaguchi and 316 of his men to their deaths. His final message to Admiral Nagumo was characteristically defiant: "We have done our best." The strategic implications of the battle became clear as Admiral Yamamoto reluctantly ordered his forces to withdraw. The invasion of Midway was canceled. The Aleutian operation would proceed as planned, but without meaningful support, and Japan's grand strategy for ending the war in 1940 lay in ruins. The empire that had seemed invincible just 24 hours earlier now faced a long, grinding war of attrition against an opponent whose industrial might was just beginning to reach full production. As dawn broke on June 5th, American search planes found only debris in oil slicks where the mighty Japanese mobile force had steamed the day before. The battle that had begun with such promise for Japan had ended with the most decisive naval victory in American history, achieved by men who had refused to yield despite overwhelming odds. June 5th to 7th, 1942. The morning of June 5th dawned gray and overcast, with scattered rain squalls reducing visibility across the vast battlefield. Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on Enterprise's bridge, studying intelligence reports that confirmed the magnitude of his victory. For Japanese aircraft carriers had been sunk, but the enemy still possessed a formidable surface fleet that could potentially reverse American gains if given the opportunity. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding USS Hornet, pressed for an aggressive pursuit of the retreating Japanese forces. The veteran aviator argued that American dive bombers could finish off the remaining enemy cruisers and battleships, potentially ending Japanese naval power in a single campaign. But Spruance, mindful of his responsibilities and the larger strategic picture, chose the conservative course that would preserve his forces for future operations. The Japanese retreat was anything but orderly. Admiral Yamamoto's staff worked frantically to reorganize their scattered forces, while maintaining the fiction that Operation Me might still succeed. The heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, damaged in a collision during the night withdrawal, limped westward while their crews fought to keep them afloat. These crippled ships would become the final targets of American air power at Midway. Naval history and heritage command records indicate that the battle was considered the decisive engagement of the Pacific War, with communication intelligence successes, allowing the U.S. Pacific Fleet to surprise Japanese forces. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney led his Army Air Force bombers from Midway in the final attacks of the battle, flying B-17 Flying Fortresses. Sweeney's crews had struggled throughout the battle to score hits on maneuvering ships with high-altitude bombing. Now, with the enemy cruisers damaged and barely moving, they finally found targets worthy of their efforts. The heavy cruiser Mikuma absorbed bomb after bomb as American aircraft struck throughout June 6th. Captain Shakao Sakayama fought to save his ship as fires raged from bow to stern, but the damage was too extensive. By evening, Mikuma had rolled over and sunk, taking 389 of her crew to the bottom. Her sister ship Mogami survived with heavy damage, a testament to Japanese shipbuilding, but a floating symbol of defeat. Aboard the submarine USS Nautilus, Commander William Brockman had spent 3 days trying to penetrate Japanese screening forces. His obsolete submarine had been depth-charged repeatedly. It had missed several torpedo attacks, but Brockman's persistence finally paid off on June 6th. He found the listing Japanese carrier Kaga abandoned but still afloat, and put 3 torpedoes into her hull to complete her destruction. The human cost of the battle became apparent as rescue operations continued throughout the week. Coast Guard and Navy vessels searched the debris-strewn waters for survivors. Finding both Americans and Japanese clinging to life rafts and floating wreckage, the traditional enmity between the combatants often gave way to simple humanity as American ships rescued Japanese sailors, providing medical care and treating prisoners with dignity. Chief Petty Officer Bruno Gato, shot down during the battle while flying as a gunner in an SPD Dauntless, was captured by the destroyer Makigumo along with his pilot, Ensign Franco Flaherty. The 2 Americans were interrogated about American capabilities, but revealed nothing of military value. Their courage in captivity would cost them their lives. Both men were executed by their captors, and their bodies thrown overboard, a war crime that would not be revealed until after Japan's surrender. Captain Buckmaster made one final effort to save USS Yorktown, organizing a skeleton crew to reboard the carrier and attempt to tow her to Pearl Harbor. The ship's list had stabilized, and her magazines had been flooded to prevent explosions. For a moment, it seemed the veteran carrier might survive to fight again, but at 0600 hours on June 7th, Yorktown suddenly rolled to port and slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the most battle-experienced carrier crew in the Pacific Fleet. As the last shots of the battle were fired and the final rescues completed, both sides began assessing the strategic implications of Midway for Japan. The defeat marked the end of their offensive capability in the Pacific. Without their trained carrier pilots and with their mobile striking force destroyed, they would be forced into a defensive posture for the remainder of the war. Admiral Nimitz's assessment was characteristically understated but profound. Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. The commander of the Pacific Fleet understood that Midway represented more than just a tactical victory. It marked the moment when American industrial might and fighting spirit combined to turn the tide of war. The empire that had seemed invincible 6 months earlier now faced an enemy that had proven capable of matching Japanese skill and exceeding Japanese determination. The Battle of Midway ended not with a climactic final engagement, but with the gradual dispersal of forces as both fleets returned to their bases. Yet the implications of those 4 days in June would resonate throughout the Pacific War and beyond, proving that technological advantage and tactical surprise could not overcome the fighting spirit of a free people defending their homeland. June 8th, 1940 to present day, the silence that fell over the Pacific on June 8th was profound and pregnant with meaning. Wherefore days earlier the thunder of aircraft engines and the crash of bombs had echoed across hundreds of miles of ocean, now only the wind and waves disturbed the vast battlefield. Admiral Nimitz received the final battle reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understanding immediately that the war had fundamentally changed character. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's body was never recovered from the waters near the Japanese fleet, but his sacrifice and that of his entire Torpedo Squadron 8 had not been in vain. Their suicidal attack had drawn Japanese combat air patrols down to sea level, leaving the enemy carriers defenseless when the American dive bombers arrived at high altitude. Every man in Torpedo 8 had died, but their courage had purchased victory for their comrades and their nation. The strategic implications of Midway rippled outward like waves from a dropped stone. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt understood that the victory provided the breathing space America needed to fully mobilize her industrial might. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox called it the most important naval battle since Trafalgar, recognizing that American forces had proven capable of defeating the supposedly invincible Japanese Navy. Historical analysis by the National WWII Museum confirms that Japan's main goal was removing the United States as a Pacific power, but the Midway defeat effectively ended their ability to achieve this objective. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito received Admiral Yamamoto's battle report with characteristic restraint, but the implications were clear to Japan's leaders. The carefully planned operation to end the war in 1942 had instead guaranteed that the conflict would continue for years. Minister of War Hideki Tojo began planning for a defensive war, understanding that Japan's offensive capability had died in the waters off Midway. The human stories emerging from the battle illustrated both the horror and heroism of modern naval warfare. Aviation machinist mate second-class Harry Ferrier, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, was rescued after floating in a life raft for 36 hours. His account of Lieutenant Commander Waldron's final words, "We'll give them a fight they'll never forget," became part of American naval legend. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, spent weeks in a hospital bed analyzing what had gone wrong at Midway. His conclusion was brutally honest. We had become overconfident and careless, while the Americans had learned from their defeats and grown stronger. The man who had led Japan to its greatest victory also witnessed its most devastating defeat. The technological lessons of Midway influenced naval aviation for generations. The vulnerability of aircraft carriers, demonstrated so dramatically during the battle, led to improved damage control procedures and fighter direction techniques. The importance of intelligence gathering, proven by American code-breaking success, established communications interception as a permanent feature of military operations. Admiral Spruance's careful handling of the American task force during and after the battle established him as one of the war's premier naval commanders. His decision to retire eastward rather than pursue the Japanese surface fleet, though criticized by some subordinates, preserved American strength for the offensive campaigns that would follow. Spruance would go on to command the Fifth Fleet during the Central Pacific Offensive, applying the lessons learned at Midway to victories across the Pacific. The battle's anniversary has been commemorated annually by both nations, though with different meanings. American ceremonies honor the courage of sailors and aviators who turned certain defeat into decisive victory. Japanese memorials remember the sacrifice of men like Captain Yamaguchi and the aircrew who died far from home in service to their emperor. Both nations learned from Midway that modern warfare demands not just courage, but also intelligence, preparation, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Today, the coral atolls of Midway remain largely unchanged, their runways and bunkers slowly surrendering to tropical vegetation and Pacific storms. But beneath the waves lie the remains of Yorktown, Soryu, Kaga, and Akagi steel monuments to the moment when the tide of World War II turned decisively in America's favor. Marine archaeologists and historians continue to study these underwater graveyards, seeking to understand how a smaller, supposedly inferior force achieved one of history's most complete naval victories. The Battle of Midway proved that in modern warfare, information is often more valuable than firepower, courage more important than numbers, and adaptation more crucial than tradition. The young American pilots who dove through Japanese anti-aircraft fire to strike their targets demonstrated that democracy could produce warriors equal to any trained by authoritarian regimes. Their victory resonated far beyond the Pacific, inspiring allied forces worldwide and proving that the Axis powers were not invincible. As the sun sets each day over Midway Atoll, the trade winds carry whispers of that distant battle, echoes of aircraft engines, radio chatter, and the voices of young men who gave everything to secure freedom's victory. The Battle of Midway remains not just a turning point in World War II, but a testament to the power of courage, intelligence, and sacrifice in humanity's darkest hour.